Okay, today we're going to be looking at indicator 6.4. We're going to be talking about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And before we start with that, we're going to look at a couple of learning objectives, some things you should get from this lesson after it is completed. So these are some questions that you need to ask yourself as you're going through this. And these are our learning objectives. How was the election of FDR going to change the United States' economic woes during this period? What was the New Deal, and what were some of the programs that were implemented, and what were the criticisms of the New Deal? Let's start with Franklin Roosevelt. Of course, we talked about Herbert Hoover in the last lesson and how things had gotten really, really bad, some of the steps the government took to try to improve the economy. Roosevelt would be elected in 1932, would actually run against Herbert Hoover and win. His first 100 days, he would pass legislation for the relief of the people. This legislation, his first legislation that was passed, or the full program, was known as the New Deal. He immediately enacted what we called a bank holiday. Remember, a lot of the banks closed during this period, and what Roosevelt did was he stopped the withdrawals, which would slow the panic that was going on and hopefully would prevent the collapse of the banking industry, which it did. The other thing that Roosevelt quickly implemented was something known as fireside chats. He made use of the new media that was available, and that was in radio. A lot of these broadcasts were morale-boosting radio broadcasts where he would try to encourage the country to hang in there for the most part. And the people felt like that Roosevelt was speaking directly to them one-on-one, and he would offer the American people reassurance. His first chat encouraged them to trust the banks because a lot of people had lost confidence in the banks and they had taken their money out of the banks, which caused even more problems. And this is when he gave his famous speech where he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Next, let's look at the New Deal programs that were created by Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, what was the New Deal? The New Deal, again, economic relief and recovery programs that were created during the 1930s to try to help stabilize the economy, relieve human suffering. Many people are going to criticize it, and a lot of people are going to claim it could be socialism, but it was not an attempt to socialize the United States. Some of the agencies that were created received a term which they referred to these agencies as alphabet agencies. These alphabet agencies under the New Deal were used again to stimulate the economy. And again, the New Deal was criticized from both sides, Republican and Democrat, and it didn't end the Great Depression. It sort of helped relieve some of it, but it didn't really put it to an end. It's not going to be until World War II officially starts for the United States that the Great Depression sort of comes to an end. So, but during the time of the New Deal, 3 million people did go back to work, which was great, remember we said that almost 25% of the entire U.S. population was unemployed during the first part of the 1930s. So to get 3 million people back to work was a huge accomplishment. Okay, next let's look at some of the New Deal programs that we just mentioned. So we're going to go through and look at a couple of them, starting with the Civilian Conservation Corps. Its main job, or the CCC, its main job was to create jobs building national parks and other conservation projects. This is when you saw some of the state parks that were built, like Myrtle Beach State Park. I believe it was actually built during the Great Depression, and the CCC was one of those groups that helped build it. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to grow less. Later, this is going to be ruled unconstitutional. Remember, farmers had overproduced. This was a problem that led to the farmers having issues during the 1920s. So they're encouraging farmers not to grow as much. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, built dams and power plants in rural Tennessee. And this was to provide electricity all throughout rural areas. So this put people back to work as well. The FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was created to help out banks. Remember that a lot of the banks had closed during the Great Depression. people lost their life savings. This way, the federal government is actually insuring the money that is within the banks, so people wouldn't lose all of their money. And they insure it up to $250,000, I believe, is what they insure it up to. The WPA, or the Workers' Progress Administration, were jobs in construction. This was to help improve the infrastructure in the United States, building roads and bridges and other things. So the WPA put people back to work as well. The National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, aided in business planning of fair practice, and set minimum wages and put caps on how long you could actually work as far as your hours went. So that was the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration. And then the final one, the Social Security Act, was passed during the New Deal. And again, the government would aid people in retirement and unemployment and minors. They would get money in case they were not able to work, or if they decide to retire, because what you do with Social Security is you put money in, and then when you decide to retire, the money that you have put in through the government, you actually will get a portion of that money back from what you put into Social Security. So again, these were the New Deal programs. These were the things that were implemented. You need to know these programs. So review this slide that's up, and make sure that you know these programs when it comes quiz or test. Next, let's look at the criticisms and responses to the New Deal. For the Democrats, or the liberal side that was around during that period, they felt like that Franklin Roosevelt wasn't doing enough. It wasn't enough help, and it didn't really help out African American people enough as well. So that was one of their criticisms. On the conservative side, the conservatives were arguing that Franklin Roosevelt is maybe doing too much. It's not the government's role to support the people, and that he was giving too much help. Some things that Roosevelt did that some people were really against was the idea of court packing, increase the number of Supreme Court judges to ensure that his new policies were not overturned. So he did that. The Wagner Act came out during that period. It recognized the right to join unions and collective bargaining, meaning that they could get together and argue with management over some of the issues or problems that they were having to try to resolve those issues. And then, of course, tax increases on corporations and higher income people. So they were taxing the rich, they were taxing the larger businesses. So these were some of the things that Franklin Roosevelt was doing, and some of the things that he was being criticized on as well. Historians, criticisms of the New Deal. For women, they felt like that women were sort of still being left out. We had job discrimination, that the women were taking jobs away from men in some cases. We saw a lower minimum wage that was put in for women, and the Social Security Act did not even cover women. So in some ways, yes, they were being left out. In some ways, women were being discriminated against. So there were some issues with the New Deal when it comes to women. For African Americans, again, we've talked about this phrase, last hired and first fired. They were usually the last people hired and the first people fired. 48% of African Americans were unemployed in 1933. FDR did regularly consult what he called his black cabinet, and these were African Americans who were government employees. So from time to time, Franklin Roosevelt would go to those people and discuss some of the issues and how he could help African Americans during that period.